There's a battle taking place in the data industry between two data stacks. The first, modern data warehouses. Second, data lakes. I remember when I first started in data analytics, I would often hear about big data in the same breath as technologies like Hadoop and Elastic MapReduce, which are used with data lake storage services like S3. Yet in recent years, modern cloud SQL data warehouses like Redshift and increasingly BigQuery are seeing widespread adoption. And Snowflake, a modern cloud data warehouse, had the largest software IPO in history. What does this all mean? In a recent debate on data, former CEO of Snowflake, Bob Muglia, made the claim that relational technologies like SQL always win over time. Of course, not everyone on the panel agreed with him, and you can read more about this debate in the link I shared. To better understand this issue, I recently spoke with Yali Sassoon, co-founder of Snowplow Analytics, a fast-growing open-source behavioral data solution. Yali shared with me how Amazon Redshift was a key development in the market that drove more widespread analytics adoption and shifts in existing data processes, as well as Google Analytics 360 that encouraged direct access to raw behavioral data in data warehouses. In my opinion, these developments allow SQL, which is a skill that many people in the industry already have, to be applied to even larger datasets. Here's a short clip. I'm quite curious, based on what you just said there, Yali, what are your thoughts about what that tipping point, what happened, what sort of triggered this change in the market?
I think the two big changes were Redshift and Google Analytics 360. So Redshift was sort of, I think, the first change, and before then, if you were a Snowplow user, we were loading the data into S3, and you could query it using typically Hive on EMR or like other tools in EMR, which was pretty clunky and pretty hard. Like, we were big fans of what the guys at Qbol, for example, were doing in terms of making that big data tool set much easier to use and work with. But it was a hard leap for a lot of organizations and a lot of data analysts who've grown up with a kind of traditional SQL data warehousing, Tableau type setup to go and start using the big data tools. It felt kind of qualitatively different. And then Redshift came along. So the other thing we were doing is we were loading Infobright, which was an open source columnar data warehouse that actually was fantastic for a whole set of reasons, but didn't get the widespread adoption that Redshift got when it came in. So Redshift got out, and suddenly any company with any sort of SQL chops could suddenly start applying exactly the same approach, but with much larger data sets. And that really drove a lot of uptake in Snowplow. And I think generally organizations taking on and working successfully with much larger data sets. I think there were huge numbers of organizations that had invested a lot in kind of HDFS clusters and so on, but hadn't really got to the point where that infrastructure was well socialized and being used across the business to drive value. That was a real slog. And I think Redshift and then BigQuery and Snowflake made that a lot easier, because they made the jump from SQL Server to using those tools was much smaller. So that was the first thing. But then the Google guys coming out with GA360 and sort of saying, hey, look, it's a legitimate thing to want your data in a data warehouse and to query the underlying data. That really, I think, helped move the whole market to being much more open and receptive to the possibilities that are unlocked when you give smart people access to the underlying data and give them the opportunity to start asking their own questions of the data.